The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my guests, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today, our panel will once again be answering questions from our listeners. Our first question is from Basil from Tampa, Florida. And Basil asks, last week, 6 hostages held by Hamas were found brutally murdered. One was an American. Israelis took to the street in protest to demand a ceasefire. Netanyahu went on television to ask for the forgiveness of the victims' families. President Biden criticized the Israeli prime minister for not doing enough. Is Hamas winning the conflict by turning public opinion against Netanyahu? The second part of Basil's question is, with the death of an American, what should the U.S. response be now? And Scott, I'd like to begin with you, if I may.
So this was when that news came out last Sunday. It was really one of the low points. I mean, I just felt so awful, and to watch the mother at the funeral screaming for her child to be at peace finally was just heartbreaking. The whole thing is just awful, and I know that there are lots of Palestinian families who are mourning lots of death, and it's a tragedy beyond comprehension almost, that it's hard to get your mind around it. But as far as the question is concerned, I don't think Hamas is winning the publicity war as much as they had been over the summer or last spring, when the college campuses were really pro-Hamas, not just pro-Palestinian, but pro-Hamas. And hopefully people have come to understand, especially young people who don't necessarily have the context we older people have as far as the overall conflict is concerned, that Hamas is not an organization that is seeking peace. There is not going to be a two-state solution for Hamas. And my longtime belief has been that Benjamin Netanyahu is similarly on their side in that he does not want a two-state solution. And he's willing to continue the status quo, which is obviously not going to be sustainable, and we're in the middle of that unsustainability now. What we need to do is double down on this effort to create the conditions that are necessary for a two-state solution and brace ourselves for a lot more violence. Because as we get closer to a two-state solution, haters on both sides will commit more acts of violence. And we've seen this time and time and time again. Anwar Sadat made peace with Israel, paid for it with his life. Yitzhak Rabin made peace with the Palestinians to the extent that he could and paid for it with his life. The haters are capable, and they're going to continue the violence. And as far as the American response is concerned, we need to make sure that there is a price paid by Iran for this, because Iran is very much behind Hamas. And we need to continue our pressure on them to back down with sanctions, with protecting Israel, with delivering weapons that can be used against Tehran if need be, and allow them to see that this is not going to be a winning strategy for them in the long term.
And Scott, I have a follow-up question, Mark, for you and Scott as well. Scott, you mentioned the war of propaganda, right? Do you see these, and Mark, you also, do you see these as being intertwined and interconnected, or parallel and somehow separate? The overt conflict, the fighting war, and the propaganda war, are these intertwined You said, Scott?
Very much so, yeah.
Okay. Is there a way to separate them? I mean, can Hamas lose one and win the other, or do you know what I'm saying?
I think I understand what you're saying, but the idea here that so many people have like when Hamas committed the atrocities on October 7th, so many people here came out and said wrongly that this was an act of desperation by people who were seeking peace, and that the oppression by the Israelis on Hamas was just too much and they couldn't handle it anymore. And this is what happens when you oppress people. Well, that's not exactly true. Hamas is not a peace organization. They're not seeking a two-state solution. They're seeking the elimination of every Jew in the world. It just happens to be that Israel is the local tribe there that they're going after. They would do the same for Christians. They would do the same for Muslims who do not fit into their definition of who Muslims are. And so I think people have to understand what Hamas is and is not. And as people get educated, perhaps it will eliminate that propaganda angle that they've had on their side from the very beginning of this, and understand who the players are. By the same token, neither Mark or I have ever said a kind word about Bibi Netanyahu as far as I can remember, and I stand by that. Bibi Netanyahu has not been an agent for peace, and he has failed the Israeli people and needs to be held accountable for that. Loving Israel is not the same thing as loving Bibi Netanyahu, and people have to understand that as well.
Totally agree with that. I could go back through all the podcasts, and I can guarantee that Scott or I have never said a good word about Bibi Netanyahu or are fans of him. And we got to remember that, these 6 hostages, this is a human tragedy, plain and simple. It's a human tragedy. And I'm going to actually address the second part of this. With the death of an American, what should the U.S. response be? We have to remember that we are not directly involved in this. This is something that has to be solved by the two parties that are directly involved into it. And I think the thing that gets me is it's a human tragedy. But there's a lot of human tragedies that Americans seem to forget about. Yes, this young man that was killed, a hostage that was killed, it is abhorrent. It is terrible. It is a tragedy of epic proportions, not only for his family, but for his friends and for anybody that knew him. But just now, I'm just sitting here with doing this and talking with you. There's an active shooting going on at a Georgia high school, and there are people being taken to the emergency room. And I think the thing that gets me is that they're going to demonstrate about this young man. Rightly so, demonstrate about the fact that this young man was killed, that as brutally as it was, but also demonstrate about the fact that there's an active shooting going on in Georgia at a high school right now. Why are we so offended by the death of one and not the death of many? That's the thing that always gets me with this situation. They're going to say, well, what are you going to do about it? This one young man got killed. And should we? I wish we could do something, but we can't help. We can't bring this young man back because we are not directly involved on the ground, directly involved with this conflict. This is between these two entities that are into it. But the school shooting in Georgia at a high school, that is something we could be directly involved in. We have nobody else to look to but ourselves to be able to fix something like that. I guess that's where the outrage sometimes that is felt by some Americans, and you're going to hear the Republicans are going to go nuts. They're going to go nuts over this one young man tragically being killed as a hostage by Hamas. Rightfully so. I give them all the kudos in the world. They should be outraged by this. But they should be equally be outraged and not just give us thoughts and prayers for those young people in that active shooting at a Georgia high school at this minute. They'll want to put boots on the ground. They're going to want to bomb everybody back to the Stone Age for this one young man. And I have no problem with that. Okay. But the fact is that what are you going to do about that active shooting? How about gun control? Oh, God, we can't do that. Oh, no, we can't do that. We're just going to give thoughts and prayers. It is absolutely hypocritical. To the first part, is Hamas winning the public opinion war? I don't think Hamas is winning the public opinion war. I think Netanyahu is losing it, as well he should, because this is something that is his responsibility. As Scott has said so many times, he had one responsibility: keep Israelis safe. He wasn't able to do that. With as good as Mossad is, with as good as the Israeli intelligence that is on the ground in Israel, to not know that this was going to happen is almost unthinkable in my mind. Somebody dropped the ball, and that somebody was in Netanyahu's government. I'm not going to give Hamas the credit of winning the propaganda war. I'm going to basically say Netanyahu can't win it because he has nothing to stand on.
Yeah, just to add something, I was kind of hesitant to do it, but I think Mark has stimulated this. In my mind, I'm really sorry to have to even bring it up. There is a very strong possibility that Donald Trump advised Benjamin Netanyahu to keep this conflict going until he can become president. And that at that point, he will step in with the full force of the United States and defeat Hamas. It's possible. There is no evidence of this at the moment, other than the fact that Republicans have done this before, and it's kind of a well-worn playbook for Republican candidates for the presidency to do this, right? We've discussed this before on the podcast. Nixon advising the South Vietnamese to reject a peace deal that would have ended the Vietnam War, kept the Vietnam War going for 5 more years because he had no better peace plan. Reagan holding on to the hostages, or asking the Iranians to hold on to the hostages, and which they did until he was inaugurated, because they hated Jimmy Carter so much because he had supported the Shah of Iran and got him out of Iran to have him escape accountability for the many crimes that he committed on behalf of the Cold War in the United States and America. We've seen this before. We know that Netanyahu met at Mar-a-Lago with Trump after he had spoken with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and addressed Congress, a joint session of Congress this summer. We don't know what was said in that meeting, but it is in character for Trump to have advised Netanyahu to keep this conflict going rather than seek peace. And the basis upon which Netanyahu has not agreed to the ceasefire and getting the hostages out, which he defended on Monday as defending the Philadelphia corridor in South Gaza, seems to me specious and untruthful. It could certainly be defended without Israeli control of the southern border of Gaza. If so, and again, I'm going to emphasize if here, because I don't know that we'll ever find out the truth about this, they would both have blood on their hands. Continuing this conflict because Netanyahu doesn't want to face accountability or because Trump wants to be elected president is just simply wrong, immoral, disgusting, disgraceful. More needs to be found out about it. At some point, Trump will probably admit to it, and it's just kind of what he does. He'll brag about it in some way or another. There'll be what'll end up happening is there will be an Israeli victory of some kind, and Trump will say, "Hey, that's because of me. I did that. I told them to keep the conflict going," and then we'll know that he is responsible for this because he's not going to see it as anything but his accomplishment. So there you have it.
Thank you both, and thank you to our listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, the Phoenix Research Group, an independent research consortium offering social issue solutions to NGOs and international government agencies through multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, and unbiased research. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Podkite, who does all our analytics, iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source of music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.